So, welcome everyone. I'm Claudio Garcia, president of the Outthinker Strategy Network. I'm glad that you could join us today. Just to give you some background, today we are talking about beyond the hierarchy, what companies are doing, how they are transforming their organization designs. So, basically, we are seeing a lot of transformation in the world right now, of course. I mean, a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of transformation. Digital has been a very important variable to change business model, to change the way we interact as organizations with customers, with society as well. So too many things. And there is Gary Hamel used to say that the innovation that we are seeing, products, business models, client experience are not being followed by the same kind of innovation within the enterprise, within the organizations. So there are few organizations around the world trying new things, change new things. And what we did was in the last year, the Outthinker Strategy Network invested a lot of time and resource to investigate, to research about what's happening there, which are the cases, which are the models that are emerging from this transformation that society is passing through. So today we are going in more depth about this topic. It's an end of the year, it's an end of the cycle about all the research that we did. And we have a very strong agenda today, as you will see. We will start with Kaihan Krippendorff, that is the founder of the Outthinker Strategy Network, my partner in crime in the network of strategy leaders around the world that are dedicated to learn from each other and to go in depth in topics like this. And after that, we'll have one real case of how a company is transforming the way it operates and bringing new ways to operate in a different world. That is GE. We have here the pleasure to have Kevin Nolan, the president, the CEO of GE Appliance. It will be very interesting to see. After that, we'll have a session with three amazing thought leaders that many of you probably know. We have Rita McGrath from Columbia University. We have Martin Reeves from the Henderson Institute from BCG, the research arm from BCG, and we have Tony O'Driscoll from Duke University. So very good people. And at the end, we'll come with the members of the Outthinker Strategy Network, the practitioners, strategy leaders that have responsibility to transform their businesses to this new reality. So you see how they are reacting, how they are thinking about these transformations that we are going to hear through this session. So we will start today with Kaihan. I just want to give a quick introduction about Kaihan for those that don't know Kaihan. So Kaihan is the founder, as I said, of the Outthinker Strategy Network. He is a strategy and innovation expert, both academically and as a practitioner. He's the author of 5 best-selling books, a globally recognized business thinker, a fast company blogger. He's also a professor of NYU and the Florida International University, and he has been recognized by Thinkers 50, that is our partner in this session today, and Global Gurus as a world-leading thinker for his work in strategy innovation. So I want to thank, of course, Thinkers 50, and I want to thank you, the Business Ecosystem Alliance, for partnering with us to make that a reality. And now I want to welcome Kaihan. Kaihan, thank you for coming today to talk to us. We would love to hear from you.
Claudio, thank you so much for the introduction, and it is great to be here with everyone. I just wanted to open up with sharing some of the findings that we have recently assembled, which set the stage for this event, Beyond Hierarchy. And if we think about who are the innovators that we consider are those that are going to shape society and shape industries, if we look at lists of most innovative people, we often see people listed who don't work within established organizations. We say, who are the big innovators in business? We look at the lists. They're dominated by these people: Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Michael Dell and Elon Musk and Airbnb founders and Zuckerberg and the Google founders. And what we see is that they have all operated outside of established hierarchies. You also see that they're all white men. You'll see that they share a remarkably similar story. They got an idea sometime in college when they were young, and then they moved to the West Coast, and they went to the mecca of innovation, And I want to make a point here that the fact that there's just such similarity in their stories indicates that their stories cannot be true. Like, we cannot believe that it has to be a young white man that is an innovator, that you need to be a young white man to innovate. We know that's not true. So it must put in suspicion whether this narrative is actually the truth, or whether this narrative is simply the kind of story that we like to tell, the kind of story that sells books, that sells magazines, that captures eyeballs. Because the similarity of their stories continues. They put together a small team. They've got a hipster, a hacker, a hustler, and they step into a proverbial cave. In this case, this is Hewlett Packard's cave. This is the Hewlett Packard garage. They work on an innovation, and then they unleash it on the world. And so there is this commonly held, and I argue, and I will prove, misheld belief that in order to really innovate and change industries, societies, the world, you need to do that independently, outside of the confines of an established organizational structure. Let me tell you why that's not true. We looked at the 30 most transformative innovations of the last 3 decades. This isn't our list. This is a list that was collated by a group of Wharton professors based off of thousands of submissions. And these are the big innovations. This is like the internet, email, DNA sequencing, MRIs, like the big innovations. And we looked at who conceived of the idea, who then developed the idea, and then who then scaled the idea. And we don't have time to go through all of these and explore all of the interesting implications from it. But if I could just focus you on the left side of your screen under conceived, you kind of squint your eyes, what you'll see is that the blue represents entrepreneurs, people operating outside of established hierarchies, and the red represents internal innovators, people who are operating within established structures. And what we see is that 70% of society's most impactful innovations have come not from entrepreneurs, but from employees. So let's sit with that for a second. What that means is that there is a 70% chance that the next innovation that will significantly impact society is going to come from an employee working inside of established companies. What it means is that we would live in a radically inferior world if it were not for the possibility of employees to innovate. So I'm not even saying that this is difficult, but it's possible. I am saying that it is difficult to be an entrepreneur, as it is difficult to be an intrapreneur, but that is actually the most prominent form of impactful innovation. If it were not possible for employees to innovate, you would not have a mobile phone. If you did, you wouldn't be able to connect it to the internet. If you did connect to the internet, you wouldn't be able to send an email. You wouldn't be able to write a Word document. You wouldn't, if you got sick, you couldn't get an MRI. You couldn't get a stent. You would live in a radically inferior world if it were not for employee innovators operating from within established hierarchies and companies and bureaucracies. That is the source of innovation. So we interviewed 150 internal innovators, and we asked them, what were the challenges that you face when you seek to do something new inside a company? And 7 barriers appear frequently. The first is intent, that it may be that you or they or your people have lost the intent to innovate. You've tried so many times and been told so many times you've given up. The next is need, is that people inside companies often don't understand what the company needs. They don't understand the strategy. Less than 40% of mid-level managers can name even 2 of their company's top strategic priorities. So what we need to do is we need to close the gap between what is our strategy and people understanding where to innovate so it aligns with the strategy. The next is options, that sometimes we come up with too few options. We need 50, 100 options, ideas to explore. If we myopically focus on just a few, then if that idea turns out not to be a good idea, we don't want to pivot and look for the next idea. So we're looking for a portfolio of options. The next is value blockers. This is where there is business model conflict between an innovative idea and the established business model. So if we can learn how to reconcile that, like the way that you want to price this idea is inconsistent with the way that your company currently prices it, the way that you want to market it, the way that you want to recruit for it, how you want to organize yourself is inconsistent with the norms. That's the next barrier. The following barrier is ACT, which is acting on experience. On experiments. You have an idea, and what we need to do, especially if it's a new idea, is we need to take action on the idea in order to prove that it's an idea. But our companies often ask us to prove the idea before we can take action on the idea. I sometimes I say we need to do it to prove it, but our companies ask us to prove it to do it. For example, HP, when it developed the first electronic calculator, research said that they should shelve the idea because there was already an entrenched competitor that was superior to the electronic calculator, which of course was the slide rule. And the argument was, why would anyone buy an electronic calculator when you have a slide rule? But HP decided to take action on the idea. They made 1,000 of them, and before long they were selling 1,000 a day. After you have been able to identify how to take action on the idea before you prove it, the next challenge is assembling a cross-functional team. And the problem with siloed, hierarchical structures in which you divide labor either by specialty or by business is that in order to take action on the initial idea, you have to pull together a fast-moving cross-functional team. We need to collaborate with people from finance and engineering and marketing. And those people don't all report to the same person. And so it's hard to pull together the people that will take the initial steps on the idea. And then finally, there is a bundle of environmental factors, things around leadership, around organizational structure, what talent that you recruit, how you develop, and what your cultural norms are. So these are the 7 barriers that we find internal innovators struggle with when they're looking to innovate from within. And what we're going to see today is that there are new innovations in how organizations structure themselves that help loosen up these barriers. To understand that, let's look at what work is. We think of work, having a job, as being something that is traditional. But actually, the word job is a relatively recent phenomenon. In the 1800s, very few people had jobs. This is a photo of a gentleman. He was a farmer in the United States, and he wasn't just a farmer. He was also a watchmaker, and he would tinker with and repair watches. Because he was a watchmaker, he was also an inventor. He'd invent interesting, useful devices. But his real passion was a magician. He wanted to be a magician. He would use his expertise in tinkering and mechanical design to build interesting magic tricks, like a box, and when you open it up, it looks like it's empty, but then you close it and the secret contraption opens up, and then inside, and you can pull out a rabbit, for example. So this is how people lived in the 1800s. They didn't have a job. They had many different jobs. And as you can see here, only 20% of people in the United States, but I think that correlates also within Europe and other countries, had jobs in the 1800s. But then, as we started formalizing how we organize ourselves, introducing approaches like line production, what we started seeing is people had jobs. And by the 1950s, the reality had completely flipped. 90% of people then had jobs, and only 10% did not have jobs. So the rise of the job, you can see very clearly in the frequency with which the word job is used in books and magazines and later online. And what we see is from the 1920s to the 1960s, we suddenly started talking about jobs. We never talked about jobs before the 1920s, and suddenly it was almost the only thing we talked about. And the reason, as Ronald Coase, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, described and laid out for us in his Coase theorem, it's because of transaction costs. That when it is less expensive to organize people inside a firm than the firm wins. And it takes away coordination efforts from the marketplace. So you can have internal transaction costs within a company, and these companies then will do things like identifying workers, selecting them, giving them roles and jobs, monitoring their performance. And that is all more efficient in certain circumstances within a hierarchy, because it's cheaper for you to give someone a contract to have a job rather than every day, if you're opening up your factory, try to recruit new people and train them and onboard them. However, that is changing. That new technologies are allowing the marketplace to start stealing from the firm things that the firm used to be more efficient in providing. For example, I recently moved from Connecticut to Miami, and we tried to use a hierarchical provider, a firm that would organize people to repair things and move things and unpack things and install windows and paint things. But it turned out to be very frustratingly inefficient. So instead, I started using a platform called TaskRabbit. And what TaskRabbit allows you to do is very efficiently is identify people who do certain things. Maybe their specialties at plumbing or at doing electrical installations or cleaning. I can identify them, I can select them, I can contract with them, and I can monitor their performance and give them reviews based off of their performance. And this platform ends up being more efficient than the hierarchical one. And that's just one small example of where we see something other than a hierarchy being more competitive than a hierarchy. Still today, most of our organizations are designed like centrally planned economies. And as the rate of change and diversity of options that a company must monitor and pursue proliferate, what we see is that in some areas, and we're excited to hear today in which areas this is the case, in some areas, the hierarchy becomes less competitive than its alternatives. Hierarchies are reaching a breaking point. As Jack Welch said, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the rate is the end is near. So what's happening is companies need to react more quickly than a traditional hierarchical structure allows them to do. My favorite phrasing of kind of what they're talking about here is Gary Hamel, who's written a lot about this. And he said something like, by the time an opportunity is identified and it goes up the ladder, a decision is made, and that decision goes back down the ladder, then the opportunity is already gone. And so what we're seeing is hierarchies reaching this breaking point. And the reason that we show a wave here, starts cresting when the rate at which it moves on the bottom near the shore, near the sand, becomes slower than the rate it's moving at the top, then it falls over. So we are reaching in some areas this breaking point. Now, there are very few companies that are purely run as hierarchies. And in fact, there are multiple ways and maybe informal methods by which companies make decisions and coordinate human effort. John Malone, a professor at MIT Sloan, who wrote many influential papers and several books, in his book, Superminds, he lays out 5 different ways in which people coordinate themselves. There are certainly hierarchies, which we're talking about today. There are also marketplaces. These could be external marketplaces, to be internal marketplaces. For example, when I moved here, I was tapping in an external marketplace to search for, find, and contract workers to work in my house. There are democracies. And even in a hierarchical organization, at the very top, there is a form of democracy where you have a board that is supposed to represent shareholders, and shareholders can vote on the board, and the board can make votes that dictate decisions of the company. So there are already democracies at work in hierarchical organizations. There are communities, groups who have an informal shared identity and coordinate each other, coordinate themselves and make decisions together. And there's also ecosystems as well, both ecosystems inside your company and ecosystems outside of your company. So it's a simplification to say, oh, it is hierarchy or not hierarchy. And one thing that we're going to explore today with experts and practitioners is how and where do these different forms of coordination, where are those more competitive? Where are they more applicable? In what kinds of situations and decisions? We're also going to learn a lot about this structure that Haier has introduced called Rendenhai. We're going to hear from the CEO of GE Appliances, and he's going to talk about really how this model works inside GE Appliances. So just a little background on Haier, if you're not familiar with them. They're an appliance maker. They bought GE Appliances about 5 years ago. After they bought GE Appliances, their total revenue was $15 billion. Since buying them, so this is after the increase in revenue from the acquisition, they grew from 15 billion to 32 billion in revenue in just 5 years. How do they do that? Well, if you ask them, what they'll say, it is by introducing a new form of human coordination. They broke down their hierarchy into 4,000 micro enterprises. Each of these micro enterprises has a CEO. That CEO leads a group of people. Those people can replace the CEO and vote out the CEO of this micro enterprise if they don't think that he or she is doing a good job. So we've taken a hierarchy, broken it down to small hierarchies, and we've introduced a democracy into the governance of that. Then they said, what about our functional units? What about accounting? What about R&D? What about IT? And what they decided they should do is also break those down into micro enterprises. And those micro enterprises have to sell their services into the micro enterprises that are market facing. And if you are running a micro enterprise and you don't think that you're getting good service from your IT department, well, you could actually choose a different IT department within Haier, or you could even go outside of Haier and you can choose someone else. So what that does is it turns these cost structures, these cost functions into revenue functions. They need to sell their services internally. And if they're not able to sell their services internally, that means they're not providing sufficient value, and effectively their budget is cut, but not through a centralized hierarchical structure, but rather through an internal marketplace. We've shared this with many companies, large US companies, and they're really intrigued by this idea and this structure. And we're going to get to today to hear how that actually works. So we wanted to understand this structure a little bit more and understand what are some specific things that we can show increase a company's performance if they adopt elements of this Rendenhai model or similar models to it. And we surveyed 500 mid-level managers with decision-making capabilities, and we tested out 8 different attributes. We found 4 for which there is a strong, statistically significant correlation between this characteristic and their ability to recruit and retain top talent and their overall financial performance. So I'm going to lay these out for you, and then we'll get to the program here. So we asked a group of questions, and 2 of the questions were, on a scale of 1 to 5, state whether you completely disagree or strongly agree, and then there are ranges in between 1 to 5 on the statement, we are better than our competition at recruiting and retaining top talent. That'll give you a talent score. Then we asked the same question for financial performance. Over the last 3 years, we have significantly outperformed our competition and done so consistently. 1, strongly disagree. 5, strongly agree. And then we asked a few other questions. We asked, in my company, our company treats people like entrepreneurs rather than employees. You can rate that 1 to 5. 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree. And what we found is, again, these are highly statistically significant. We're talking about the probability that there is no correlation of being less than 0.2%. So there is a clear correlation here. Now let's look at the magnitude of that correlation. If you treat your people like entrepreneurs rather than employees, you will have a 1.6 times advantage on recruiting and retaining top talent. In other words, the probability that you are better than your competition at recruiting and retaining top talent is 1.6 times higher than a company, your competitor, that treats people like employees. How about financial performance? A 1.4 times. So you're going to outperform your competition by 40%, you could say, if you treat your people like entrepreneurs. Just that one statement, I think, is profound, because what we need to do, recognizing that 70% of society's most impactful innovations have come from employees, we need to start embracing the fact that they have agency and creativity, and they have innovativeness, and they can act as productive entrepreneurs, and you will outperform your competition if you do that. Then we looked at this question. We primarily operate as business units, or we operate in small decentralized teams that are like micro enterprises. We also see a statistically significant correlation between this element of the Redenheim model and performance. You will be 20% better at recruiting and retaining top talent. You will outperform your competition by a factor of 1.3. And I want to say something about these numbers here. You know, the difference in performance between a gold medal winner and a non-medaling athlete in the Olympics is something like 2%. So here we're talking about 30%. That can make the difference between you being the gold medalist or you just being someone who just, ran with the pack. Then do we make budgeting decisions based off of centralized hierarchical control, or do we make that through an internal marketplace? And again, we see a statistically significant correlation. If you manage through an internal marketplace rather than centralized control, you are going to be 50% better at recruiting and retaining top talent and 30% more likely to outperform your competition. And the last one, which I'm personally really excited about, and when I present this, I find a lot of resonance for this idea, this possibility, and excited today to get into how you can actually make this happen, is the question, do we require people to adopt designated shared services? In other words, do we tell people, this is the IT department, you need to work with this IT department. This is the R&D department, you need to work with the R&D department. Or do we give them a choice of shared services? Do we let them say, I don't like the service I'm getting from that IT department, I'm going to go to a different IT department? And what we see again is a strong correlation. You will be 60% more successful at recruiting and retaining top talent, and you will be 30% superior in your financial performance. So these are just 4 elements that I think we can all understand and start implementing within our organizations that will enable us to outperform our competition in talent recruitment, retention, and in financial performance. And this is the first time that we've seen, at least, and we've looked at other studies, a clear, statistically significant correlation between elements of something that can start looking like an alternative to the hierarchy, or maybe a complement to the hierarchy, and performance. And so what today is about, what I'm excited about learning about today, is what are the first steps that we can take to start shifting beyond hierarchy. Very excited to be here with you. Thanks, Claudio.